All right, I think we'll get started. Catherine, should we get started?
Sure thing.
Welcome, everyone. For those of you who don't know, this is our Pressing Matters series, which we do once a month. This is the first series of this year. And Pressing Matters is a time of discussion. We hope to have some of these forums in person. We started as strictly online because of COVID, but eventually we hope to do some of these in person. But for now, it's Zoom, and we're thankful for that. Why do we do this? Journalism is changing rapidly. Our students have a lot of questions. How do they get a better understanding of the field itself? And a lot of that comes by asking and answering questions, and this is why we exist. So we're here to foster discussion, try to answer some questions, and to hear from people who are working in the business right now. And we're delighted to have Ruth Graham with us tonight. Ruth is a national correspondent covering religion, faith, and values at the New York Times. She previously worked as a writer and reporter at Slate, and she's covered a number of issues in her career related to religion. She's a graduate of Wheaton College, and we are thrilled to have Ruth here with us tonight. Ruth will have the floor for a while, and then we'll kind of open it up to questions. After that, I'll ask Ruth some questions, and then we'll open it up to the general population here on Zoom. So Ruth, welcome, and I'll give you the floor, as it were.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. I wish that we could all be in the same room and I could see you, but here we are, and I'm grateful that it worked out this way. So thank you for that introduction too, Rich. I will start just by giving you a little micro version of my career and just sort of how I got to the Times. And then what I thought I would do is just walk through a couple different stories that I've worked on at different points in my career to kind of illustrate some of the things that I hope you're interested in. So I did not plan to be a journalist. I didn't take any journalism classes at Wheaton. I didn't work on the school paper, had no concept of this. Kind of a different era, I think, where I wasn't thinking about my career at all in college, for better or for worse. But I moved to New York City after college. I had grown up in the town of Wheaton and had a really great experience at Wheaton, but was like ready to not be in Wheaton by the time I graduated. So I moved to New York City and met an editor at a startup newspaper there. This also kind of feels like a different era. It was a print newspaper with a very begrudgingly ran a tiny website attached to it that didn't get nearly as much attention from the editor or the publisher. And that newspaper is no longer a paper, maybe unsurprisingly hearing that, but it was called the New York Sun. And that was also just a fantastic experience because it was a small paper, super scrappy, just kind of kept throwing me in the deep end. And I was able to do a lot of different editing jobs there, mainly in the arts, and some reporting, although that was not my job there, my primary job. A few other jobs in between that I won't bore you with, but I ended up moving to rural New Hampshire after I got married. My husband was a college professor up there, so we moved up there. And that's when I started freelance reporting full-time and really focusing on religion reporting. I had done some sort of one-off freelance pieces before that, and I'll kind of walk through how I got started doing that too. But at that point, about 10 years ago, is when I started full-time freelance reporting. Eventually got hired by Slate. And then about a year ago, started at the Times as a religion reporter. And I now live in Dallas. So the Times did not want me in rural New Hampshire. There's almost no religion in rural New Hampshire. And so moved down this summer to Dallas, Texas to cover faith from just a place where there's more faith stories and also just kind of easier to get around the rest of the country. So that's the sort of potted history of my career. But I will go back now to when I started thinking about religion journalism from kind of a critical perspective, from more of like going from news consumption to thinking through like, what would it mean for me to do some of this? I will say at Wheaton, I was a political science major, and it was a requirement of the department, if I'm remembering this right, maybe it was just certain classes, but to subscribe to the New York Times. And at the time, that meant that we would, you'd get the physical paper, this stack would arrive in the department every day, and you'd go pick it up, in the department every morning. And it was like, I'm really, really grateful for that now. So I don't know if they're still forcing you to do that in any format, but I'm so grateful for that now, because it got me in the habit of reading the news, thinking about the news before I had thought at all about participating in making the news. So this was during the Bush administration. I'm dating myself, but I guess that ship has sailed. And there was a lot of the media was kind of like discovering evangelical Christians in the Bush administration. When Bush entered the White House, he was running. He described himself as an evangelical, and it wasn't even necessarily like a strong kind of bias in the traditional sense, but it was just, there was a lot of coverage that was like bewildered. So actually, let me, I'll see if I can figure this out here, how to share my screen to show you an example of this. Let's see, here we go. This is from The Guardian. And it's a really shocked, I mean, I wish I could share the whole thing, but I'm not going to just like read a whole news story to you, but a piece about a book that had come out about Bush's faith. And it was just this very like shocked coverage. So there was the book, which depicts a president who prays each day and believes he's on a direct mission from God. Are you guys still seeing when I click over like that? I just want to make sure. Are you still seeing the Guardian story there? Okay, perfect.
Yep.
So a lot of this kind of coverage and just, depicting like praying each day as something totally alien and as like a sign of this like extremist kind of barging into the White House. And that's an example, it's not even that this particular article is so egregious, but it just kind of shows like the tone of a lot of the mainstream media coverage of Bush, who I think we now think of as like a quite mainstream evangelical. I mean, no matter what you think of him as politically or of his presidency, faith-wise, like this was someone that millions of Americans immediately recognized and didn't find like a strange figure at all, but the media coverage was like not approaching it that way at all. So, in order to cover a culture, a movement, a community, a country, like you have to know what is unusual within it and what is not unusual. Like that's news is like what is new, being able to discern what's new. So praying every day is not unusual. Like it might be worth writing about. It might be like an interesting piece of his personal faith, but it doesn't signify, an extremism within the context of like all of American religious culture. The story there, I think, was more that somebody who belongs in what had for decades been a completely mainstream expression of American Christianity was in the White House. And that might be, they're notable in many ways, but again, like not in the way that a lot of the media was approaching it at the time. So, I sort of saw an opening there because I was able to, so sorry about that. I was able to, let me just turn that off there. I was able to sort of see the flaws in those stories and see the gaps in them and like knew that I could do better with some of that stuff. Not necessarily like national political reporting at that stage of my career, but knew that I could cover evangelicals in a way that was like more nuanced than a lot of the coverage I was seeing. So I started to pitch. This would have been, when did Bush go out of office? 2008, probably kind of toward the end of the Bush administration is when I was really starting to freelance a little bit more, pitch a little bit more. And, always, maybe not always, almost always, I was writing for secular publications. And I didn't ever see my job as doing like PR for evangelicalism or for any faith community. I don't only cover evangelicalism now. I just what I started out doing mainly. But the job is, clarity, truth. These are core Christian values. It felt very much of a piece with the faith that I'd been raised in, with my education. Hey, Mary, no. Sorry, a 6-year-old intrusion. I'm glad I'm screen sharing right now. You would have just seen a little 6-year-old head pop in. And the work of doing that kind of reporting, also you're building. So I was saying, not doing PR for evangelicalism, but also doing tough reporting. But in the meantime, you're building trust among sources to kind of do the difficult work by being accurate and fair and covering, not just the difficult stories, not just the scandals, but trying to get at like the whole breadth of faith in America. So I will click through to just a few stories that I've done over the course of my career, and just kind of talk through some of these issues, just in terms of bias, being alert for my own bias and how I approach the reporting. This one I'll go through kind of quickly. This is a story that I've been thinking about lately because Christianity Today is doing this really fantastic podcast right now about Mars Hill that some of you may be listening to, and I highly recommend. It's really fascinating. So this is a story that, oh my gosh, is almost 10 years ago, about Mars Hill, when Mars Hill still was very much Mars Hill. And before it had all fallen apart, which, because I had done some of this reporting early, was able to cover those developments as they happened. But I was aware of this story because it was bubbling up on like Christian blogs, on social media. And, I was just rereading this story, and there are certainly some things that I would have phrased a little differently. But, I was able to go in there as a reporter for Slate, which is very secular, and kind of pick apart, what's unusual about this church and what is not unusual, non-denominational, not unusual, megachurch, not unusual, formal membership itself, not unusual, the theology. And then that, I think, lets you make kind of a stronger case through the reporting for what is unusual about some of the allegations of abusive leadership. And some of the really problematic things in the church, by being able to kind of establish as a reporter that you can discern, that you understand that like signing a membership, contract alone is not grounds for thinking like, gosh, this is a cult, a word that I really, really don't use. And I don't want to say I've never used it, but that's a word I really don't like to use, but that obviously critics of religion love to use. Here is another story that I did for Slate much more recently. This is less than 2 years ago. This is a really challenging story. I don't know if you guys remember this kind of, reading about this in the news. It was covered by a lot of different places. It's a very, very delicate and hard story. It was a family that was a part of Bethel Church in Redding, California. They were a high-profile couple within the church. They were on the worship team, had big followings on social media, really well known in the community, and their 2-year-old daughter died very suddenly, really heartbreaking. And the church, kind of led by the parents, it seemed like, was praying actively for the girl's resurrection, her literal resurrection in the days after her death. They were gathering together in person at the church, but it was also, and I think kind of more intriguingly, a social media phenomenon. So the mom had asked on Instagram for bold, unified prayers to bring her back, and this really just spread like wildfire. And here's a story where there was something at the core of it that was very unusual. It is not common to pray this publicly, in particular, for a literal resurrection. It's also unusual that it played out on social media. They used the hashtag #WakeUpOlive. But it would have been really easy to write a story that just kind of left it there and was like, look at this bizarre, sad thing, and kind of just kind of leave it there as something to gawk at. And, I have to say, as a kind of side note, it's a little bit out of my control whether or not people, as careful as I tried to be, read this story that way anyway. It's totally possible. In fact, I would say it's probable. And that's just, I have to do my best as a reporter to like not encourage that and not feed into it, but also know that, especially covering a beat like religion, where you're kind of introducing your audience to things they may have never seen before or think are really strange just on their face, that's going to be, the interpretation is a little bit out of your hands. So anyway, but to get back to it, it would have been easy to kind of write that kind of story and just leave it there. But I knew from past reporting, and what also became clear as I started to report on this story, as opposed to just kind of copy out what had been happening on social media, there was a lot of context that made this much more complicated than it seemed at first glance. So Bethel is a major, very sophisticated in many ways church in Northern California. It's not in the South. It's not small. It's not kind of like a snake charming scene. Although there's great reporting on snake charming out there too. I will say that's like another fantastic and rich topic. So I don't even like to use that term in a derogatory way, but that's not what Bethel is. The people involved are like stylish social media kind of types. And so I think, that alone is kind of counterintuitive, and just that fact just kind of establishes that, hey, this isn't that obscure, because these are people who look like a lot of slate readers and, listen to the same kind of music and all of that, are kind of in the same culture that you're in. And then there's also the unfamiliarity just of charismatic Christianity as a whole. So I'm not going to, again, like copy the whole story, but like here's one paragraph, which I also kind of selected because I ended up quoting Craig Keener, who I don't know if you know, but he's a Asbury Theological Seminary professor who's really fantastic on charismatic topics, who I've talked to for a few different stories over the years. But again, you can see this is just one of a couple paragraphs that I used to explain, like to put this in context of Bethel's faith, and kind of translate a little bit what charismatic Christianity is. I got into the history of it a little bit. And again, quoting Craig, I think source selection is that's something I pay a lot of attention to as a writer. There were plenty of people I could have called who would have just slammed the church and kind of given me like an easy, spicy quote on how depressing or weird this was, or even something subtler, but someone coming from like far outside that tradition. And I really valued Craig's voice in this. He's written about other contemporary resurrection accounts that he finds credible. And he didn't begrudge the parents' instincts to pray this way, but then he also was able to express caution about, the particulars of this case. By this point, there had been 5 days that had elapsed between the girl's death and the resurrection, which was sort of longer than what he had seen in these cases that he considered credible, longer than the periods of resurrection described in the Bible. So again, that to me felt like a really effective way of kind of casting some skepticism and concern on this story without doing it in the obvious way, to sort of say, hey, even within this tradition, even among people who are inclined to be very sympathetic to this kind of effort, there's still cause for concern here. And I also included the fact that the church leader had acknowledged that the outcome was unknown. That's important to me because I suspected that a lot of readers would have thought, they're just completely delusional and everyone's 100% confident that she's just going to like pop back to life. And I saw this much more as, a sincere prayer for literal resurrection, but very entwined with lament. And it's like, it's a radical act of faith where I think, you can be both you can sort of be acknowledging reality in the same breath that you're praying for a miracle from the God of miracles. So for me, this was a really poignant story and an opportunity to do kind of a more complicated faith story. And I will say, this is a story that when I later went back to Bethel, I have not spent time on their campus, but I mean, called them up again, requesting interviews to report a story for the Times on the prophecy movement. They were open to talking with me because they had thought this story was fair. So, it's also an example of, you never write a story just to please a source, but, in this case, they, again, even though it wasn't completely flattering, had thought that I handled it fairly. And that has led to further kind of conversations with them that have been helpful for me in other reporting. And then I will click over to one last story and then show my face again. This is one for the Times that I did that I was really proud of. About Amy Coney Barrett. This is very delicate, very politically fraught story because she was a Supreme Court nominee at this point. It was last fall. She had not been confirmed. And there was just a tremendous amount of interest in every aspect of her life. And so previous reporting had shown that she, I think it was maybe a past round where she was considered like a finalist for the Supreme Court and didn't make it. And the Times, a different reporter at the Times, had reported that she was closely associated with this group called the People of Praise, which is a Catholic charismatic group where people live in a very, very tight-knit communities. There are just a couple of them around the country, and there are just I think 1,600 some members overall. She had been raised in this community, and by all evidence, is deeply embedded in it, at least until very recently. So if I'm remembering right, we don't have confirmed current membership, but certainly a significant part of her adult life, which would be, to me, that is a totally reasonable thing to report on. If someone's getting sort of basically everything in their lives is getting covered, then certainly their faith life is a part of that, especially when they're going to be ruling on things that are relevant to these issues. So, religious liberty, gender, schooling, all of this. It seems totally fair game to me as a reporter, but it's also a situation where, again, it would be very easy to kind of other this group and skew it to make them seem less familiar and scarier, as opposed to more familiar, and to kind of actually understand the group more. So this was a long story that was on the front page of the paper, and we opened with a scene found in a magazine article published by the People of Praise decades ago, if I'm remembering right, in which her father quit a job in order to stay with the People of Praise community in Louisiana, and was such a powerful illustration of just the deep commitment to living in community, which is really one of the distinctives of People of Praise. They're a super interesting kind of amalgam of influences. Her particular group is centered around Notre Dame. There's a really strong kind of intellectual streak. There's a strong 60s and 70s kind of communal living hippie streak. And then there's Catholicism mixed in there. It's just a really, really fascinating group. And I got a little bit of pushback internally while reporting this. I shouldn't say pushback, but we had real conversations about how much to emphasize the group's beliefs about sexuality and gender norms. And they're a conservative group. So I'll just read you the sentence or two sentences, I guess, that, much discussed internally. And this is what we ended up with. The group's beliefs, including a strict view of human sexuality that embraces traditional gender norms and rejects openly gay men and women, are in line with other conservative faith traditions. What is notable about the group, according to documents and interviews with former members, is that even in the context of devout faith communities, members of the People of Praise are deeply embedded in one another's lives. So, not that there's nothing to quibble with there, but I was pleased with how that came out, because it says very directly their views on sexuality and gender norms, which are increasingly unusual, within mainstream culture. but also says very clearly that they're in line with other conservative faith traditions, and that I didn't believe that that should be at the very top of the story. To me, that was one of the more, quote unquote, normal aspects of this group, or not unusual, which again does not mean not worth remarking on, but it's just very important to set that in context. Another aspect of this story, people in the group, I'll flip back to myself now. People in the group did not want to talk on the record. They're incredibly close knit. They were very aware that this was a really, really tense time for Coney Barrett, a tense time for the group. To me, very understandable that they don't want to talk on the record with the New York Times. The people who did want to talk were people who had grown up in the group, had left for one reason or another, some quite disgruntled, some more mixed, but obviously had all decided to leave. So we put a line in the story that said, since those who did agree to interviews had left the community, their perspectives were more likely to be negative. That to me also was an important thing to kind of acknowledge. That it's like, listen, you can only talk to who will agree to talk to you, which is, that's kind of the pitch that I make to people all the time who don't necessarily want to talk, but I genuinely think would benefit. I want to include everyone's perspective in the story, but at least, acknowledging to readers and stating very plainly that the only people we could get to talk were people who had decided to leave. So that's that story, which I was happy with, and I think came out in a balanced way, which again doesn't mean everyone loves every piece of it, but I thought it was fair. So, I guess the last thing I would say, because I am kind of running up against time here, I love being a religion reporter because I love, and I'm not even speaking about my personal faith here, but like, I just find religion, every religious tradition, basically fascinating, moving. I get to talk to people about life and death, the deepest things. I just today was doing a really quick story on the Mormon Church's decision to require masks inside their temples. And had just a little aside where there's a line about the line between, on both sides of the veil, I think. And I was asking an expert, like, what does that mean? And she said, well, the temple is supposed to be a place where the veil is thin between the living and the dead. And I was just like, wow, like that's just what a beautiful, beautiful concept for like a sacred space where the veil thins. I mean, that's one passing moment in just today. But I love that kind of thing. But as a reporter, it's more than that. Like, I can't just do stories where I'm gushing about like how beautiful X tradition is because of this. But I think what I can sort of take from my instinctive attraction to all these kinds of ideas and those kinds of conversations is just taking care to explain to readers what draws people to religious practice. So, and I actually think, it's all the more important when I am reporting on a scandal, on something really ugly, bringing those things to light is really important. And I think a piece of those stories is always like, why didn't people just walk away? If this was an abusive faith community, an abusive church, if this horrible thing was happening, then why not just leave? What kept people coming back? What kept people attached to this community? And the answers to that is not always something that's beautiful at all. But I just think a lot about making sure that every story makes clear to readers what keeps people in religious communities, that, all the good reasons and all the bad reasons. But, I was thinking as I was preparing for this about a story I did about Hillsong Church last year as well. That's a tradition, like kind of the slick mega church scene, that's personally not appealing. It's not, I still go to church, and that's like very much not the kind of church that I go to. But it was really important to me in describing like how Hillsong New York sort of quasi fell apart. This was around the scandal around their pastor who had left, who was like a friend of Justin Bieber and kind of this like hip pastor, and he left. And it was really important to me in that story to illustrate like why were so many people attracted to this? So that's always on my mind. And the very last thing I will say, and maybe we'll get into this in the Q&A too, that just, I know that, if some of you are thinking about how or whether to get into journalism and what that might look like, is that my faith background has been a huge asset to me in my career, in every sense. And I actually try not to talk about like my personal beliefs or like where I am or list my own kind of, it's not about my own beliefs necessarily, but just my background and the values I draw from that background. I was talking about truth and clarity before, have been so helpful to me in this field. And I also think, frankly, like my identity, being able to say that I went to an evangelical college, that I went to evangelical K through 8, and all of that, it builds a lot of credibility for me as a religion reporter. And also, I really think, in every newsroom I've ever been a part of, or every place I've ever like placed a freelance pitch where it's relevant, editors see that as an asset. So I'm not going to pretend there's no bias in any corners against Christians in this industry. But you would be shocked. I'm just thinking about the religion beat alone, how many really, really top reporters in this field have faith backgrounds. So my own editor and the other national religion reporter, we all went to Wheaton. I don't make it, now I'm making it sound like it's Wheaton specific, and it's not. But they're the ones I'm more attuned to. And there's a lot of people that have really strong faith backgrounds who are in the mainstream media. So we're here, and honestly, it's not it's not difficult to be here. Like I've never hidden it, and it's really only ever been an asset to me. So I hope that's encouraging. And yeah, I'd be happy to talk or answer any questions about just my career, my process, anything you guys might want to talk about.
Thanks, Ruth, for that. It is encouraging, and it's fantastic that you're doing this kind of work. It's hard to imagine that you would be able to do this job without your faith background. I don't know how can somebody write a religion beat without some sort of faith background at all? Because I think it's probably happening, but I can't imagine.
It is certainly happening. I mean, it certainly is, and I think you can do it. I actually believe really strongly that you don't have to have a particular identity to take on a certain beat, and that it's possible to just bone up on the beat and talk to as many people and listen with an open mind and an open heart, and like that's how, if they transferred me to the education beat, or I guess everyone has an education background, but if they transferred me to a brand new beat, I would hope that I would be able to take these same skills there. But I think it really helps, and it sort of bakes in. There's like an empathy that comes from knowing people of sincere faith, knowing that faith is more than just how it intersects with national politics, which is how a lot of coverage. I think that's how a lot of coverage gets assigned, is because people who aren't religious have a hard time seeing religion stories as anything other than like, okay, is this a Trump story? Or, how does this, especially during the Trump era, honestly. So I don't think it's impossible, but I just think it's a huge asset to have it. Yeah.
There are probably people watching this now, some of our students and students who will watch it, who don't even realize that what you do is a job. How many opportunities are there for people who can specifically cover religion, whether it's for a newspaper or other media outlets?
Yeah, I wish I had better news on that front. There are certainly fewer full-time religion correspondents than there used to be, but they do exist, and plenty of local papers actually still have them. A colleague out in Colorado just moved to the Tennessean to be their religion correspondent. There's a religion correspondent for the Dallas Morning News right here where I live in Dallas. So I mean, there certainly are these full-time jobs. You can look at, it's the Religion News Association, which is kind of the hub for all of these jobs and a lot of this reporting, like there's a lot of kind of networking that happens there. So if you're interested in kind of learning more about, the beat and what kind of jobs are out there, that's a good resource. But yeah, there's not a lot. The Times added me. I mean, they already had a national religion correspondent, and national for it means I'm on the national desk, so I cover the U.S. as opposed to foreign desk or New York. And so, that specific desk already had a religion correspondent, and they thought we need more religion coverage. Like there's more than this one person could handle. And so they brought me on. I mean, I think that's incredibly encouraging and like a real sign of investment in these stories. So it's not all doom and gloom. I think it's not a function of like a lack of interest in religion. It's a function of what's happening to local newspapers, and just what their budgets look like now. But it is a job, and there are certainly other reporters get to write about religion all the time too. So you don't necessarily need this title to get to do it.
For those who will go into mainstream reporting, just general assignment type reporting, who maybe evangelicals now, and wondering how they fit into the profession, can you offer any encouragement in that regard, or discouragement?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would say the same thing that I ended with, which is just that I have not encountered discrimination based on my background at all. And I've always been very forthright about it. I've also been very careful to not like describe my work or approach my work as if I'm like doing PR for a certain, like, for the background that I happen to have. And so I think you have to be scrupulously fair, but as you do anyway, right? That's a part of being a reporter. So I don't think that's a special hardship. It's just that's a part of how you're taken seriously. But the sort of lines on my resume and the background, and even the kind of empathy that I bring to the reporter, there's the reporting, especially at Slate, I did often kind of weave in my personal experiences, and doing a lot more kind of opinion-ish reporting at Slate. And I wrote an essay there after Billy Graham died about kind of my, I don't want to say relationship with Billy Graham. I never met him, but his wife's name was Ruth Graham. And I had grown up in a town, in the town of Wheaton, where I could like see the Billy Graham Center from my bedroom, and I've just kind of had this like kind of processing my own relationship with evangelicalism through this weird like forced proximity just by our names and all of that to Billy Graham. And that was an essay that like was deeply about my identity and like processing of my identity as someone who was raised evangelical. And there was a big readership for it there, and maybe more importantly, like my editors completely got it. My very secular editors totally got it. So, I mean, the truth is, like, this is a very religious country, and people who are religious want to read about themselves, in ways, they want to read reporting that gets it. And people who aren't religious want to understand the rest of the country. I mean, so there's a huge appetite just from readers for this kind of reporting. And so it's not a terribly hard sell. I mean, I guess that again, I'm kind of drifting into speaking more about religion reporting specifically, but I just think it's an advantage to say, like, this is where I come from. These are sort of where my connections are. In some ways that you're basically saying, like, I understand the country in a way that, some reporters don't.
I often hear from students, and really maybe more so their parents, that there's sort of an effort to exclude conservatives, evangelicals from the profession. I always thought that was overblown, that that's not really the case. Can you speak to that at all?
Yeah, boy, it's really interesting. I strongly feel that religion reporting has gotten there's so much better, deeper religion reporting than there was like during the Bush era. You know, that clip that I showed you and that style of reporting, I just think is much less common these days. And at the same time, the resistance that I get from sources and like the outright loathing and mistrust for me as a mainstream media reporter is like, they're completely inverse. Like as I perceive the reporting has gotten better in the mainstream media, the distrust and like outright aggression has just ratcheted up. I don't know if I have a perfect view on it, because certainly being at the Times, you know, for some people that is like an avatar of the worst of the worst, which I'm simply reporting that, not conceding it. And I genuinely think like that, I mean, the Times gets so much blowback from the left too, for doing too much sympathetic, you know, too many stories where we're like out in the middle of the country talking to Trump voters or whoever, that is perceived as like overly empathetic. So, you know, I don't know how privy you guys are to that conversation too, but just trust that like it's coming from both sides.
I guess it
Yeah,
must
go
be
ahead.
at
Mhm.
times difficult to do your job when you approach a faith community or a church. They see somebody, even if they don't know you personally,
Right.
somebody coming from the Times, and they don't want anything to do with you.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think for almost every other reporter, it gets easier to get people to talk to you when you come to the Times, because there's a lot of people who want to be in the Times, and it's just not true on my beat at all. With Slate, honestly, a lot of people hadn't heard of it. You know, a lot of people that I was covering had not heard of Slate, and so I could just you know, I was always honest about what it was, but it was more like introducing myself, and getting to talk, please talk with me, without all the baggage of like what they thought of the publication. And, you know, unfortunately, it's just unavoidable. You know, everyone knows what the Times is and has an opinion on it, then that may be formed by reading the Times, but also may be formed by Fox or Facebook or whoever. So yeah, that piece of it is challenging sometimes, but you know, again, it's just like doing bit by bit, like trying to do stories that are fair. And then the people you cover in one community, you know, then you go to them and say, who might talk to me about this? And, you know, you just kind of build your reputation bit by bit, and try to get past that.
Can you talk a little bit about your day-to-day life? How often do you write? How often do you expect to write a story? That sort of thing.
Yeah, it's not a really strict writing schedule. I mean, I work a lot, but it's not like you need to have 2 bylines a week, because there's very much an understanding that some of the things I work on will take 6 weeks kind of on and off, and then and other things take 1 day. And so it's really not, no one's like counting bylines. I don't think, at least they've never told me that they are. I don't want to know if they are. So, you know, a typical day, like this week, I pitched, like on Monday morning, I had a conversation with my editor, who I'm talking with kind of all day long. And that the main measurement of like my productivity is if my editor knows that I'm busy, basically. So she keeps very close track of what I'm working on and like the progress I'm making. And so the measurement is kind of her saying like, Ruth is pushing ahead on these things and like turning them in on time and all of that. Mm-hmm. So, you know, pitched a slightly longer term thing this morning, and we've been talking about, I started reporting on it right away by phone. Today, we had a conversation about kind of where and whether I should travel to do some reporting for this story. And then in the meantime, you know, very quickly, we have these like live briefings that are shorter stories, including a series of briefings on what's happening with the virus. And when the Mormon Church announced that they were going to require masks, it was like, Ruth, can you do something, you know, really quickly on that? So I wrote, you know, 400 words in an hour and a half or something on that. And that's already out. You know, that sort of comes out instantly. And then, you know, hopefully tomorrow, you know, unless something breaking happens, I'll return to this longer term story. But there are always things that, you know, I'm in Texas and I've also been covering the new abortion law here quite a lot. So there have been a few times in the last few weeks where all of a sudden there's an appetite for kind of like a big story on that I'll either collaborate on with other reporters or take the lead on myself. There's a ton of collaboration at the Times, which is really new to me, where I'm sharing a byline with like 2 different people and we're all working together on it all day and kind of dividing up the reporting. So that's been, it's incredible, but it's like a kind of a new way of working for me. I was used to, and I think it's much more common to just kind of be a lone wolf where it's you and your editor hashing things out, and the Times is much more collaborative.
Just one more question before I open it up to everyone else. How much of what you do is a result of your own ideas versus things that your editors want you to cover?
It's about 50-50. So typically the longer term kind of featurey stuff that's not super time sensitive, most of that comes from me. Not all of it, but most of that comes from me. And then most of, but not all of, the kind of day-to-day, like responding to the news, covering, so-and-so died, or I don't do obits, but if there's some so-and-so was charged with a crime and like everyone's covering it, Theodore McCarrick, Cardinal, is charged. Okay, like you're on that for the day. That kind of comes from the top. And once in a while I'll get like a newsy scoop where it's something that I have uniquely and I'll bring to my editor and say, can we do this for tomorrow? But yeah, overall it breaks down to, I would say it's about half and half, which for me is it's a good mix. Yeah.
Questions from the group? Lexi, go ahead.
Okay, the one question that I kept coming back to is like, because you're a faith-based reporter and you're constantly surrounded by faith-based stories and like stories about religion, like how do you still feed yourself spiritually and keep your relationship with God like still at the forefront when you're always surrounded by it, to keep so you don't get sick of it?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. I don't know how, I hope I can give a satisfying answer to this that's also honest, where like I'm not sure that that's quite the terms like that I would use to talk about it, but I go to church very regularly. I just moved, so this is but I've been going to the same church since I moved here, and it's a really small church. It's really beautiful. Like I feel very much like not a reporter when I'm there, and in fact, like I try not to, even when I'm meeting people in the church, since I'm kind of new there, try like to not talk about being a reporter, because I always want to be like, I'm here as a person, not like I'm not taking notes. And so trying to like keep that part of my life separate from the reporting. But I honestly don't find it that difficult, because I think I'm just very aware of that religion, like the faith practice, that there's just such a spectrum of it. And some of it is beautiful and transcendent for not just for me, but for participants. And like I bring that to my reporting. And some of it is ugly and dark and like troubling. And I hope I can bring that to light when it needs to come to light. And I suppose I bring a little bit of that. I really don't think of it as cynicism at all, but just kind of awareness. I sort of bring that to everything in my life probably, but I don't know. It honestly might just be temperament, where I'm just kind of like an optimist, like where I somehow am not cynical yet. But really, I mean, the main direct answer to that is like keeping my own church life just very separate from my reporting life, and just kind of having that as a space where I'm like, that's not the headspace I'm in when I'm there at all.
Is it difficult for you when you run into a story like the Bethel story,
Mm-hmm.
and something may be going on that even is outside of mainstream Protestantism, and might seem extreme in mainstream circles? How do you treat an issue like that with kindness, sensitivity, without and give it a sense of dignity, even if you might find it extreme?
Yeah, it's very challenging, because it's really easy to kind of like humanize the people who are like exactly like the people I grew up with or who I'm, completely comfortable around. Like that's the easiest thing. The more challenging thing is to do it where I have trouble getting there. But that's almost like a red flag for me, like to examine my own bias and like make sure, if I feel kind of an instinctual like revulsion or anything like that, then that's like, well, what's the work that I need to do to, again, to be thinking of like, how do I explain how this happened, how so many people don't feel that way. And it's just kind of like checking those instincts as they come up, because it's always more complicated than like 1,000 people are doing this totally insane thing, not necessarily referring to that, but doing this insane thing and there's no reason for it and they're all just crazy. Like that's like absolutely never what the story is, I guess, unless there's some kind of like mass hysteria. But even then, like there's that's like never the whole of the story. So when I find myself on first read kind of reacting that way, I just know that there's more reporting to be done.
Other questions?
So you started out in freelance journalism. What advice would you give for anybody interested in pursuing that route?
Figure out your health insurance. uh, it's challenging. I mean, I think it's really important, honestly, to be frank about kind of the financial side of this and like all of that, because it's it's your life, right? Like it's not just you're doing it for fun. Actually, it's great if you can do it for fun on the side. Like if you can do it at a lower pace while you have a day job, fantastic. Like then you've got it figured out. But to do it full time, I lived in New York for 10 years, and I made a ton of contacts there, friends in the industry and just professional contacts, and was able to, then when I moved to the woods, when I got married, like had those contacts and like knew a ton of editors. And I don't think it's one size fits all advice to move to New York. In fact, I think it's a real asset. I truly do think it's an asset to not live in New York. Again, if we're thinking about, editors like want cultural, geographic, all that kind of diversity. So I don't think that's like the permanent solution, but you do have to like find a way to build relationships with editors. And that can happen online in any number of ways. But just my own path was like by physical proximity and just like building those relationships for literally a decade. And then again, just to like be frank about the realities of it, I was married and my husband had health insurance. And so I could afford to, as a couple, we had one person with a stable income and I could kind of be up and down. And I ended up, I was able to make a full-time income, like not an amazing one, but I put it together. But the inflow, like you can't count on making X amount a month when you're freelancing. So, or at least I could never figure out how to like exactly predict what every month would look like. So, and you just have to be a little bit more mercenary then too, where I would take some assignments because they just sounded so fascinating to me, or I loved working with the editor, and others I took for money. And others I said no to that were kind of like medium interesting, but just did not pay what I needed them to pay. So I don't know, that's kind of like a crass answer, but I think it's like important to think that way. It's a career, it's not just a passion project. So
To kind of follow up on that, two things. The first, because you said sometimes you just took projects based on whether or not you needed them.
Yeah.
So is it as a freelance, did you do most of your own pitching, or were you kind of in their network already so they were bringing projects to you?
I started out doing much more, almost only pitching my own stuff because I wasn't in those networks yet. Like I might know people, but they didn't necessarily know yet that I was trying to full-time freelance or working that way. So initially it was almost all doing my own pitching. And then it kind of got into a rhythm where kind of the easier stuff started to, that editor sort of came to me for I don't know. I guess it probably worked out to be like 60-40, them coming to me versus me pitching. Because the truth is, there was still, when there's like a big ambitious thing that I wanted to do, that would end up being me pitching. So the first thing I ever wrote for the New York Times was a big magazine piece for the New York Times Magazine. And that an editor had liked my work and said, you should pitch us, so there was a little bit like they came to me and said, we want to try to figure something out, but like they weren't coming to me with a ready-made story idea. So I sent them one thing and it didn't quite work, but they were encouraging, and then sent another thing that they went for. And that turned out to be a really like a real inflection point for me, where that like led to kind of bigger and longer pieces that was like kind of a step up for me. So.
And to follow up on something you said earlier, because I was thinking about this, how you're a national reporter. So how do you maintain a network across the country
It's like,
and only live in one place?
I know. It is absurd that the United States is my like coverage area, because I mean, you can't, like, I can't know what's going on in every house of worship. And I don't even think faith stories. It's not even house of worship. It's everything. It's like personal belief and the entire country. So it's absurd. I mean, so I subscribe to a bunch of kind of news roundup, like, newsletters that are compiling religion stories from all over. I have Google alerts for words like pastor, priest, imam, so trying to at least do a really very basic scrape of like what's bubbling up in local news all over the place. I have people who have been sources for other stories, and there are some people who do like to talk to reporters and who will kind of send along like, I saw this, I thought it was interesting, who will just kind of keep in touch with me that way, and just so sort of having just ongoing conversations with people all over. But it's basically not possible. So the nice thing about that the Times is a national outlet is that it can be that a local paper has covered something and we don't mind then doing it ourselves. So it's a problem. Like if the Washington Post has done the exact story already, like if another national paper has done it, then it kind of then we start asking like, do we really need to do this too? We've kind of gotten scooped by a competitor. But I just do a lot of reading of like smaller local news outlets and just have a lot of conversations with people. Yeah.
Anyone else? Ruth, if you were not covering religion or faith, is there another area that you would like to cover?
I got asked this in my job interview, and I'm trying to remember what I said, because honestly, no, like I just love this beat and I hope I do it forever. But the Times likes to shift people around. Like we were talking about, could someone without this background be on this beat? And yes, because they do sort of move people around from beat to beat. So I think I might have said at the time they were hiring like a suburbia reporter, which is interesting to me. That kind of being like a city reporter is a very established thing, and being like a rural reporter is even kind of an established thing. But I forget, I should know if they ended up hiring someone for this or put it on the back burner. But I am intrigued by like any kind of reporting in like in between spaces, and where there's room for kind of like stories that surprise kind of from the left and the right, for lack of a better term. Like, so I could see myself doing that. There are general assignment national reporters, so people who are stationed in like Denver and just kind of cover the West, which, could be like national disasters or like political stories or all of that. And that's really appealing to me too. So I could see myself doing that too. I think I'd sort of be happy living anywhere. So yeah, we'll see. We'll see what's next.
Did the Times send you to Dallas because they thought that would be a good place, or did you pick Dallas?
I kind of nudged them toward it. I think they were not open to me staying in rural New Hampshire, but they asked me for suggestions, like, where do you think this position should be based? And my husband's family lives here, and like we really love Dallas, and I've spent a lot of time here over the years. And so it was a place that we had kind of daydreamed about figuring out how to live in Dallas, like how to make it work with our jobs. And so I like gave them not a hard sell. I made some other suggestions too. I think Nashville would have worked. You know, there are a lot of different good options for covering religion, but I kind of nudged them toward Dallas and they were open to that. So, and they did want it, they were investing in Texas in a pretty big way around this time. So I think it made sense with their plans. They sent another reporter to San Antonio. We have someone in Houston now. There's an editor who's from Texas, who's like coordinating Texas coverage. And I'm not technically a part of that because it's not like I'm the Dallas reporter, but they were like, this fits in with us trying to invest in Texas. So, yeah.
Well, Ruth, we really appreciate you being with us.
Thank you.
Very enlightening.
Yeah, I do too. Yeah, thanks.
For the people who are on now and many others
Yeah.
who will see this in recording after it, we just really appreciate it and thank you, and hope to see you back. Maybe we'll see you in person one of these days.
Yeah, I would love that. Thank you so much for the invitation. This was really fun and good questions. So
You're welcome. Thank you. And
All right.
thank you all. And we will see you all later.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.